Welcome back, everyone. You might have heard of the issue of forced organ harvesting. Now, this is a big issue in China under the Chinese Communist Party, but actually this impacts just about every country in the world to some extent. Here to talk with us about this and why it matters is Torsten Trey. He's with Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. And Torsten, it's a real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Torsten, we know that this practice is happening in China. We know the Chinese Communist Party has been harvesting the organs of prisoners of conscience. I'm hoping you can, in this interview, really go into this and we can talk about this and also how it impacts other countries as well. But in China specifically, how widespread is the practice of forced organ harvesting?
We can assume that forced organ harvesting is taking place in all over China. The forced organ harvesting is connected to detention camps where prisoners of conscience are held. Those detention camps are also spread all over the country. We have seen photos from an airport, for example, in Xinjiang in the northwest, where signs were saying an express line for organ transports. And this is very unusual because that sign, that photo was in a city with 500,000 people. It is unlikely a small town like this has such a traffic of organs that it would require a sign for an express line. It is rather an indication that despite the small area, the flux of organs is much larger than one would expect for that region. So we can be sure that this is taking place all over China because it is organized by the state, and the state has certain goals, for example, to involve different layers of the society and people from different areas into this whole scheme. So it is the interest of the Chinese government to get all the different areas and regions involved to sustain this machinery.
So this is kind of like genocide for profit, essentially. They found a way to make profit off of genocide. Is this accurate?
Yes, there are different layers involved. One layer is or the main layer, the main goal of this practice is to eradicate a group that is ostracized by the CCP. It is framed as enemy of the state. It is the part of the prisoners of conscience. It's a group of Falun Gong practitioners which is persecuted since 1999. Since the Tiananmen massacre, China has a big problem to eradicate people that are ostracized or people that the CCP wants to eradicate. Since the Tiananmen massacre, the CCP knows that they cannot simply go out and in public eradicate people in a large scale because the response from the international community can be too strong for the CCP to handle. So they deceive the international community by toning it down, making it a slow, continuous process, which we in a previous article described as a cold genocide. The purpose is to eradicate a certain group that is ostracized by the CCP.
You mentioned Falun Gong or Falun Dafa as being one of the main targets. Is it limited to Falun Gong, or are they the biggest group, or what's the scale roughly, and are other groups targeted by it?
Yeah, I believe what happened is that in 1999, the practice was limited to, the procurement of organs was limited to taking organs from executed prisoners. But there was a limit to it because the crime rate does not suddenly increase, and you cannot rely on this pool of people to harvest organs on time. So what happened is that they took this concept of taking organs from executed prisoners and just shifted it to the group of Falun Gong practitioners. That happened in the beginning. So after then of course they increased the whole concept of forced organ harvesting. They established a transplant industry. Once it was established, they also then established or try to get other groups also involved in this machinery, and then expand it to other groups, other minorities as organ source. But Falun Gong is the primary victim and by far the largest group of victims.
You mentioned they regard Falun Gong practitioners as enemies of the state. What is the reason for this? Could you explain to us?
Well, if I say this, then it's very important to say that the perception of enemy is only one-sided. It is coming from the CCP. It's not coming from the Falun Gong group. It's coming from the CCP. The CCP has a certain way of handling things. It is deceiving enemies. It is deceiving adversaries. It is following deception and lies, and also uses violence to achieve its goal. All of this is contrary to the principles of Falun Gong, which it follows compassion, tolerance, truthfulness. So the CCP must have perceived Falun Gong as a threat. However, the threat is not coming from Falun Gong. It is a perceived threat by the CCP.
In terms of what organ harvesting looks like, I think most people, they think organ harvesting, they imagine a person who's brain dead, they take their organs out for the organ transplant, and that's it. The person is killed technically, but typically it's done with people who are brain dead. What does forced organ harvesting look like? In
our upcoming World Summit, we have several speakers who will address this topic in detail. And I can give you a little outlook on this. There are different layers of how and at what point the death of the person is taking place, and also the organ harvesting itself. The forced organ harvesting, as we understand, is the killing of people not as part of a court sentence or a death sentence, but is the killing of people for the purpose to harvest their organs while they are still alive.
So these are people who are still alive, taken, and while they're still blinking and breathing. Are they unconscious? Are they cognizant? Or do they give them medications to numb the pain? How does this work?
Yeah. So in the past, the organ harvesting took place in the fields, in the scope of executions. But the problem is that there's a time delay from the execution to the moment when the organs are harvested. So this has been, in a way, maximized by shifting the executions from the field to the operation room. So in the operation room, you have the ability to apply medications that for example, stops the heartbeat, or the perfusion where you can actually time the moment when you actually remove the organ that you want to transplant.
And you mentioned too that the only crime these people have committed is faith or believing in their religion. Is this accurate?
I would disagree. It's not a crime, but this is, as you say, this is the perceived description. But this is not a crime. This is a basic human right from all of us, and there is absolutely no explanation and no concept that would justify the killing of people for their organs for whatever reason.
What kind of stories have you heard of people coming out of China and explaining what this practice looks like? What are people telling you about this practice? Are you getting doctors? Are you getting lawyers? Are you getting people who've had friends or maybe themselves almost faced it? What are you hearing from people?
Yeah, in the course of the past years, I had the chance to interview several almost victims, and they tell me, for example, while they were in detention for about 2 years, they were forced to blood tests, about 10 blood tests within 2 years, but without a concept of providing medical help, because they were also tortured at the same time. Or other victims said that, to illustrate maybe the industrial scope here, that from a detention camp, about 200 Falun Gong practitioners from one camp were transported in buses to hospitals in order to have these forced examinations and blood tests. Another almost victim told me that he was detained and detained on the same day of his detention. He was taken to the hospital on the first day to the hospital, and they wanted to draw blood from him, and he refused because he said, "Well, I know what you want. You want to draw my blood to harvest my organs." And at that moment, the policeman, the so-called 610 officer, said, "This is exactly what we want to do." So in a way, the policeman admitted this practice to this person. And we have other cases where people were called to detention camps to see their family members in a freezing chamber because they were told they just passed away. They just passed away, although they were like in good health just the day before. And in other cases, there were reports that organs were missing. And you see, there are plenty of stories from many different people. Those people are not here. Those people are not interviewed. Nobody pays attention to it. But although they all have a different story, everyone has a different experience. They all come together in the same scope, with the same concept of being forced into the narrow way that leads to forced organ harvesting.
You mentioned some details on what this looks like in China, that they essentially have prison camps. They not only harvest the organs of people, but they actually torture them. They faced various forms of torture before they might go through these operations, and they take these prisoners of conscience and bus them to the hospital to draw blood and see if they match, I guess, a potential person in need of their organs. What is the situation in these prison camps? You mentioned that torture is involved as well. Can you explain this to us?
Well, since 1999, this group of Falun Gong practitioners is being persecuted brutally, severely in China. Torture has quickly become a mainstay of persecuting the victims. And of course, in that aspect, torture deaths also occurred. The practitioners of Falun Gong were tortured to death. However, if you do so, then you would not have the incentive of gaining the money that you would otherwise gain from the practice of forced organ harvesting through transplantation.
Now, you mentioned as well that, of course, this is pretty widespread. It's been going on since 1999. If it's been going on since 1999, why do we hear so little about this? What's the reason for this?
Yes, there is certainly ignorance and silence involved. And in our upcoming World Summit, we also have a session that will discuss this kind of silence in the news media. I would highly recommend to watch it because you will find very interesting information about this. But at the core of this is silence and ignorance. Part of the reason might be that the CCP is active to bribe certain news media and outlets to stop them from reporting it, because, as you may imagine, this topic is a very sensitive topic that if the world community would realize this is happening, it would create a lot of problems for China. So China tries everything to suffocate any reporting, any news about this issue.
Now, I have heard some stories about, there have been proclamations from lawmakers in the U.S. standing up against it. And I do know this doesn't get a whole lot of media coverage, but there are a lot of officials in the U.S. who've actually taken pretty strong stances and acknowledged this is happening and stood up to say something about it. What are the voices of support? And actually, and on the note too, I want to get into your summit in just a bit, but To what extent have you received support from the international community in exposing live organ harvesting in China?
There's quite a bit of support that we have received. There's, for example, the U.S. Congress passed the House Resolution 343 in 2016. The European Parliament also passed a written declaration 48 in 2016. And there were other declarations that basically expressed to China that we know about it, we know what is happening, and it is basically the hope of these parliaments and governments that China would stop it. But in this regard, the support is huge, I would say. And from 2013 to 2018, our NGO, Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, has organized a global petition to the United Nations Human Rights Council, and we gathered more than 3 million signatures, which is one of the largest civil petitions in history. So from this, you can see there's a large support, and many people, the majority of the people in the world would take a stance on it. What is missing is the final step where all these people, all these governments, unite to say to China, you have to stop this.
Now, I know early on, and epochTimes, of course, broke a lot of the original stories on forced organ harvesting in China. I remember early on that a lot of media and a lot of experts in the, outside of China excused it and kind of wrote it off, saying you can't prove it. Yeah, there's circumstantial evidence, but it's not strong enough. But I know that over the course of the years, actually, there has been really substantial evidence that has come out, and a lot of the original claims have already been, well, proven true. But a lot of people aren't told the new information. They still hold the older narratives where you had experts coming out and saying, oh, you can't prove it. What is some of the proof we've seen where we can say for a fact live organ harvesting, forced organ harvesting, is taking place in China from prisoners of conscience?
Well, let me respond in a different way. The concept of asking for proof is faulty, I would say. There is book-filling evidence about the practice. There are plenty of investigators who have written hundreds of pages of evidence. There is the China Tribunal that conducted an independent review of the evidence. There is more evidence available than in any other crime against humanity that has happened. At this point, we are at the stage to want to conduct more investigations on Chinese ground. So what we have, let me say it this way, what we have in evidence is completely sufficient to call the police and say, hey, I believe a crime has been committed, and I want you as the force of policing to go and take a look. So we are not at the stage with to go to court with the evidence we have. We are at the stage to say there's plenty of evidence. The international community must have the right and has to insist on going to go on Chinese ground, to go into the hospitals. We are at the situations where we know there are, like in history in Nazi Germany, we know there are concentration camps and people are exterminated. Now we want to have people, the UN, the United Nations, and independent investigators to go on the ground, to go into these camps in China to find more evidence or the concrete last evidence. But the narrative that I haven't seen a camera footage of somebody taking out the organs in an operating room, that's why I don't believe it. That narrative is faulty.
Now, in terms of the international effect on this, you mentioned that, of course, the Chinese Communist Party does try to silence Western media and media outside of China in general. And through different forms of influence, they might try to prevent people from talking about this. How does organ harvesting in China affect the world, especially as we know there's a lot of investment going into China, businesses there, media, as you mentioned, being silenced? To what extent does this impact the international community?
I would say to an extent that many people in the West underestimate. China has the policy or the agenda to dominate a discipline. Once it takes charge of a discipline, it wants to dominate. And in this case, it wants to dominate the transplant field. The West stays uncompetitive because in Western countries, we follow ethical standards for the benefit of the patients. There's a purpose of it. That comes with waiting times. It is based on altruistic organ donation, which requires consent. All this apparatus is being bypassed by China. So China, it is almost impossible for the West to compete with China in the transplant field. Once China has become the leader in the transplant field, it will be the voice to set new standards in the transplant field. And if you can, as you can imagine, by despising ethical standards of the West, the agenda of the Chinese government will be to basically tear down the value system of the Western society, to tear down the ethical standards. So what we see is we see the beginning of China as a dominant country in the transplant field, which is about to tear down our value system and ethical values in the transplant field. So this is has huge complications coming up in the future. But on the direct impact, we can say transplant tourists travel to China for organs, bypassing national laws. Pharmaceutical companies and companies that produce medical devices are taking advantage of it. Medical schools that train doctors from China are also involved. So you can see that a large scope of professions and people from the West are being pulled into this scheme and unknowingly or knowingly becoming accomplices in these crimes against humanity. So the impact on the West is tremendous, and it is much larger than perceived at the moment.
And so to kind of get the bigger picture on this, in other words, there's a large-scale crime against humanity, genocide, taking place in China, where people who believe in religion are being taken, tortured, put in camps, and killed for their organs. You have foreign businesses working with the Chinese Communist Party, financing it, media organizations silent on this atrocity, government officials acknowledging it's happening but not really gathering together to really try to stop it on a large scale at least, or a kind of a cohesive scale. And you have people able to travel to China to get organ transplants, sometimes knowing and sometimes not that the organs they're getting are from people who will be killed in order to give them these organs. And you're saying that aside from all of this, if this is able to continue, that China may be able to rewrite the standards abroad on organ transplants. Do you think that would mean that the practice of forced organ harvesting could also spread abroad?
That's exactly the point. The system of ethical standards as established by the World Health Organization, the World Medical Association, national associations, all of it is based on a free voluntary consent as a foundation to donate organs. This concept of free voluntary consent is basically destroyed in the concept of forced organ harvesting. And the problem for China is that the international community has these ethical standards. Basically, these ethical standards of international communities are a threat to the practice of forced organ harvesting in China. So China is highly interested in tearing down this system to basically make forced organ harvesting the common standard in transplant medicine. Why? China can refer to prisoners of conscience as a livestock of organs, as a living pool of organ donors. In other countries, this is not the practice. So if China is able to make forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience a staple source of organs in the transplant field, then China has become the world leader of transplant and is unrestricted in its pursuit to eradicate ostracize prisoners of conscience.
Well, Dr. Thorsten, that's very concerning. I guess just as a last question, I know your organization is starting up this summit and you're also launching a new set of standards, and the hope is to, well, prevent this vision of the Chinese Communist Party from taking hold globally. Can you tell us about the summit and what these new standards you're hoping to introduce are?
Yes, this World Summit is designed to commemorate the victims of forced organ harvesting. It is a solemn, a noble platform to address the issue of forced organ harvesting. We have gathered experts from all over the world who come together united to stop this egregious crime. And what we try to achieve is to break through a silence that has facilitated this forced organ harvesting over years. We want to break the silence, and we want to stop the taboo, or break through the taboo to talk about it. What we try to achieve is to combat and to prevent forced organ harvesting. And I hold that the most powerful and most peaceful way to stop this practice is to give the victims a voice. And if we understand that the main goal of the CCP is to eradicate Falun Gong, to silence Falun Gong, then we also know that talking about it is the most efficient way, most powerful way to defeat that purpose. So by giving a stage to the victims and talking about the victim group, the main victim group of Falun Gong, we also break through the silence. And the goal that we achieve is that at the end, we will be able to provide the world with a new declaration to stop this practice.
Hey, Dr. Thorsten Trey, thanks for being on Crossroads.
Thank you.